Hello everyone, this is Noor Musa.
I'm Alana Travers.
Welcome to Confused Iraqi.
Confused Iraqi is a half history, half storytelling, half unpacking confusing narratives about Iraq podcast. Our last episode looked at the 1990s, and today we're going to be talking about the 2003 US-led invasion of Iraq. I should start this podcast by saying we won't be breaking down all of the reasons that the US and its coalition partners, including the UK and 40 other countries, decided to launch an invasion, which occurred on the 20th of March 2003. But we will be looking at the implication for this on the ground, and also the narratives that were set in the UK and beyond, and which have lasted my entire lifetime. To anyone curious about the political decisions that were made behind the scenes, I'd recommend a podcast by David Dimbleby called The Fault Line, which looks at how the George W. Bush and Tony Blair administrations led the coalition into a war and the issues of weapons of mass destruction, who believed there were, and how they learnt there weren't. But Noor, tell us a little bit about what it was like for you. You were 11 years old in 2003. Where were you living, and were you expecting this invasion?
At that time, my family was living in Baghdad, and for over a year, the news were a bit disturbing. Every day, Saddam Hussein on TV for hours with his cabinet discussing the war. At that time, Iraqis had only one TV channel when they are in different parts of the country, but in Baghdad we had two TV channels. We had a national one, and it's like one that is a bit more entertainment based. So the national one, the news one that was podcasted for outside Iraq was a bit serious, and the news were a bit disturbing for us. Is there going to be a war? Is there not? And my family was concerned. My father was at that time in the military. He decided to leave. And then we moved to Najaf. He didn't want us to be in Baghdad if a war does happen. So it was a bit disturbing time, and people weren't sure if something would happen or not. You have Saddam Hussein confirming to people that things will be fine, even if something does happen. And at the same time, people see that massive countries like the state, the UK, a whole coalition is planning on attacking Iraq.
And I guess you were a child at the time, as was I, so it's tricky to remember what exactly we were being told as opposed to, what was being said. I feel like, I don't know whether you feel like you're slightly rewriting the narrative in your head about what you experienced, but certainly I look back and I think, I don't know, was the media critical enough? Were our parents aware enough? Like, all that sort of thing. Did you get a sense of why this was happening at the time?
This is the thing. We only had one source of information. So we were hearing, and I'm not sure I fully remember.
Yeah.
I do remember the meetings on TV because it was like, I want to watch cartoon, but I only see Saddam Hussein and his cabinet on the TV the whole time. But yeah, we do hear about the Iraq has nuclear weapons, and then that's not really true. As Iraqis, like, we believe that it is not true.
Well, I'm interested. How did you hear about the nuclear weapons issue?
I didn't understand it by that time, but I knew from my family for a fact that Iraq didn't have anything. That Saddam Hussein, if he would have that, he would have used it. And at the same time, Iraq did build a nuclear station, and it was immediately destroyed by the Israelis. So we know that we didn't have that, but we somehow knew that at the same time Saddam is not really wanted anymore by the West.
Yeah.
So that was a good excuse, probably.
It's really curious to me. Again, I kind of want to talk about this more, but I know it wasn't the main point of this. But this whole issue of weapons of mass destruction, the fact that the UN weapons inspector at the time, I think he left Iraq, and there's some controversy over whether he was kicked out by Iraq, whether he was pulled out by Clinton before George W. Bush came into office in 2001. There was a guy called Scott Ritter who basically went around America, around the world really, trying to tell people he was absolutely certain that based on his work in Iraq in the 90s that the chances of Saddam, of Iraq having any serious weapons of mass destruction were basically nil. He said the max they could have was about 2% of all they had before they were destroyed in the 90s. So that, for me, it seems sort of like quite frustrating to look back on this period, and especially now there's been even more sort of maybe we can say revisionism over what happened. The fact that this whole kind of narrative of going in to rid the world of a guy on the axis of evil, or the war on terror, all that kind of thing. I wonder whether we could talk really, really briefly about this sort of post 9/11 narrative. Did he pick up on that shift in Iraq, or is this a hypothetical question? Because at least in the UK, in the US, I think that was really the turning point that brought all of the subsequent action into reality.
I remember seeing the news. I remember it being shocking to everyone, thinking that it is a Hollywood movie, because this is like, it can't be real.
Yeah.
This is happening in the States. And it's definitely impacted the Saddam Hussein cabinet at the time. They were concerned probably, and the news were a bit, I would say, they were a bit friendly to the American side. They were showing some compassion, because this is a thing. I wouldn't say that was the approach that Saddam Hussein would take. Everybody knew that Saddam Hussein wouldn't take that approach, probably, like the tourism part of it. So I do remember it, but not really much. But I know that it was shocking, and people thought, this is definitely going to impact it. Like my family, at least our community was like, this is not good for us.
No.
Yeah.
No, and actually, interestingly, again, there's all sorts of arguments to make about whether this was conspiracy, whether this was deliberate, whether this was honestly just naivety or a very misguided view of the Middle East. But there's definitely a shift in 2001 with you can see George W. Bush when he gives speeches talking about Osama bin Laden. He also talks about Saddam Hussein, and he almost puts them in the same category of it. Again, I'm looking at sort of narrative building, trying to make them kind of equal or comparable on the sort of the global stage of terror, evil, whatever you want to call it. Which, I don't know, for me it seems, well, for anybody I suppose who's kind of aware of geopolitics, not correct. And Saddam Hussein put a $10 million sort of hit. Basically, he put $10 million on Osama bin Laden's head, which I don't think you would do for someone you see as an equal partner.
Yeah. There's something about Saddam Hussein that is good and bad at the same time. He's never he was never a religious person. I was like a strict Islamic who wanted to impose Islam. He never was that. He actually, during Saddam's same time, as Iraqis, we didn't have that religion culture strongly. Like Shia, where I grew up, didn't enjoy like celebrating their religious belief. That on that side, I would assume that he didn't really like the approach that the Qaeda had, or like their thinking. On another side, at the same time, Saddam Hussein was pro-Arabization. He was very nationalist and very into the idea of Arabs taking control over their region, which was a bit racist, but at the same time, that does not really also subscribe with the Qaeda thinking.
No, and I think also, before we go back to your personal experience, we should mention something else, which is another narrative of the US war, the Iraq war, the US invasion, is that actually not everyone sees it as an invasion. And certainly, I'm sure, senior US officials at the time, or particularly maybe those who served, would not call it that. And actually, I was in a taxi a couple of months ago with my brother, who was visiting here. We were coming back from Suleimania, which is in the east of the Kurdistan region. And I was talking to him about, I was probably bossing him around, lecturing him about history or something. And I referred to the Iraq war, the Iraq invasion. The US invasion. What did I call it? The 2003 invasion. So many confusing different ways of saying it. Anyway, and a guy in the front of the taxi, who I've since become quite good friends with, he's a Kurdish professor. He went to Durham University in the UK. He's turned around in perfect English, said, well, actually, we don't call it that here, or we don't all call it that here. And he refers to it as the US liberation of 2003. And of course, that's because of Saddam Hussein's persecution of the Kurds, the Kurdish people, but also because the Kurdistan region has, objectively done very well from the post sort of 2003 shake-up, right? And so this is something that we should obviously keep in mind, when we look at narratives of the war. And I don't mean to, steamroller and call it what I call it, but from my perspective, particularly feeling a sense of complicity in the fact that this invasion destroyed the state and failed to rebuild it. But anyway, we should acknowledge other people. Let's go back to your experience. Sorry, I'm talking so much.
No, but this is the thing. Nobody wants to be living under a oppressive regime. So many Iraqis were already they lost a lot because of Saddam Hussein power. The Iran war by itself cost the country a lot.
Yeah.
And then Kuwait war, people just wanted to relax for a bit, and then that never happened. And then the economic sanctions during Saddam Hussein time. While this is the thing, what people were watching TV and they see Saddam Hussein celebrating his birthday for 4 days in his big castles, moving around, and they didn't have anything.
Yeah.
So that wasn't really good for Iraqis to see that and live and experience oppression and deprivation. So I'm sure many people didn't want it, but at the same time they didn't want war.
No.
Because war, they experienced war, they know what is war. And they didn't want what happened after the war.
No.
There was anticipation for things to improve. Unfortunately, everybody knows what happened after the war. But this is the thing, for my family, of course we didn't want war. As I said, we moved to Najaf. Najaf is very different to Baghdad. It's a bit more religious, more close community. And when I was in Baghdad, we used to play the whole time in the streets. As I said, my childhood was very fun time.
Yeah.
But when I moved to Najaf, everything shifted. Girls are not allowed to play out in the street. I had to wear hijab, stay home, which was very difficult time for me. And then the only thing I could do is watch TV, and again, not much on TV, other than news. And then my father just left the army, and that was also time for us to spend time as a family, trying to figure out life, and also being concerned about a potential war coming, not understanding what is happening. So at that time, we were living in I would say the only apartment building compound in Najaf. And right across our apartment, so Saddam Hussein, this is one of the theories that Iraqis have, that because of this, that American invasion happened.
Really curious,
yes. So a few years prior to the American invasion, Saddam Hussein initiated a military campaign internally called the liberation of Al-Quds, Al-Aqsa, with Judaism. So he wanted to liberate it.
Maybe you could just explain where this is.
That's in Palestine. It's for Saddam Hussein, the Palestinian cause was very important to him, and he was already supporting people there, and his intention was to liberate Palestine, and he had conflicts with Arab countries only because they didn't agree with him and didn't want to support him.
Yeah.
So he started building these military bases in neighborhoods, so right in front of neighborhood, a compound is very civilian safe neighborhood. You have a military bases that teenagers, even sometimes children, some adults who wants to liberate, not really wants, they were forced to join.
Well, let's be honest. Sorry.
To liberate Palestine. They started these, and then these spaces have training locations, they have weaponry, and the last 2 years before the war, I said, I grew up going to the balcony, I just see the whole thing in front of me, the military training.
My God.
So the country became a bit heavily militarized. There was a campaign to liberate Palestine, and that's something that Iraqis think maybe it's because of these, he used to call them Jaysh al-Quds. It's Al-Aqsa, Quds military. Yeah. So that was one of the the theories. So growing up, seeing that, and we had actually a friendly relationship with these guys. So whenever we have remains from our food or we cook extra, my mother send it to them because just sympathize with these young men in the heat, standing guarding a gate, or many of them in front of us. But yeah, it's just the announcement of the war. I've had very vague memory on that. All I know is that we all of a sudden were in my grandfather's house, very tiny house in the old city of Najaf, which is like the old cities of everywhere in Iraq are very tiny areas. Like we have very tiny, narrow roads with small houses. So we went there, and my other aunts were there with their children, lots of us in the small house, trying to save food, water in plastic bags, trying to buy the essentials, sugar, milk, try to freeze things, and everybody, all adults, go out to the market to buy stuff. And at that time I was very close to my aunt, so she took me also, and I was seeing everyone just going crazy buying the essentials and trying to see what, like, we're still confused. No, we don't know what is happening.
Okay.
That was in Najaf. Other parts of the country, I'm not sure, but I would assume that in Baghdad and Basra, the situation was a bit more intense, to be honest. In Kurdistan, I have no idea. But as you said, they probably were less concerned, or actually a bit more concerned that Saddam Hussein might attack them again.
I guess, honestly, it's, I'm sure they were equally terrified. It's easy to look back and, I guess, put our own sort of narratives on it, or like everyone knew the war would end like this, but you know, I suppose even the UK, US had no idea how it would end. I suppose they had this hubris and you know, military might. And of course we mentioned this in the last podcast, that Iraqis had just been under 10 years of intense sanctions with limited, you know, imports of food and medicine and that sort of thing. And you know, what was the mood like? I mean, people must have been desperate. And
I don't remember people being very like sad or like very scared.
Okay.
Probably because they are used to war. Okay. I just remember the adults in my life. They were like around 4 or 5 that I remember clearly. My grandparents, my parents, my aunt, my other aunt and her husband, and they were just trying to figure out what to do. That was the main focus. Like, what should we do to be safe? Joking around, trying to figure out how to save water, and that was, you know, like at that time, electricity and water still continuously, these are issues for Iraqis. But the only moment that I remember from war, I shared that with you before the podcast, is like just before the news got a bit serious. It was like, Americans are coming. We knew at that moment Americans are coming on the radio.
Can you remember what month that was, or roughly? Or
I think it was in March.
Okay, so it was just before.
Yeah.
20th of March.
So I heard the news, and then I immediately ran to the other room. The house only had 3 rooms, small house, and I ran to the other room crying. And I remember these adults that I just mentioned, they all came towards me. It's like, what's wrong with you? No, I was like, I don't want to die. And they were like, no, it's totally fine. You won't die. No. Everything is fine. And then I immediately forgot about it. I just remember the radio got a bit serious. The tone changed. And at that moment, I realized there is a war. This was my first war that I actually could recognize what is happening. But again, the adults were totally fine, trying to understand what is happening. This is not their first experience. And again, in Najaf, we didn't feel war much. During that time, it was that I remember the battles were a bit more intense in Basra.
Well, that was where the UK went.
Yes.
Right.
People were trying to defend the entry. And in Baghdad, the bombing.
Yeah.
But anywhere else in Iraq, it was a bit quieter,
Anbar,
easier.
Ramadi.
Of course, Anbar.
Probably hit the worst.
Because you know, like Saddam Hussein trusted allies were from these part of the countries, like
Sunni.
The Sunni Arabs, where he is originally from, that part, Salahuddin and Anbar. So he had people there, and the bases were there. And in Basra, obviously, Basra is like the port and where you have to defend yourself. But then we just heard the news about the war, but we didn't see it. The only 2 things that I would remember from Najaf this whole time, 2 war figures, I would be like, one is seeing the American helicopter very close to where my house is. Like, we could see the guys in the helicopter, and they were like waving at us, and we were like, what is this? And the second one is just my father coming back from the market after we heard very loud explosion. He's saying it's just like, something was pumped.
I have a question about the George W. Bush address to the nation, something that we hear a lot about in Western narratives of the war. He sort of went on TV and told the Iraqis that, the US was coming to liberate them of Saddam Hussein. Did you watch that? Did people watch that? What did they think about it?
I've only watched it years after, because at that time we had radio.
Okay.
We didn't have TV. So I remember hearing that was the announcement for Iraqis, like, it's safer now, you can go out, the war somehow is ended, we managed to capture Baghdad. So we call it Baghdad Fall. Even in the national holiday for Iraq, we don't call it the Iraq War or the invasion or whatever, like Baghdad Fall. So that was the announcement, and that's when my family decided it's time to go back home.
Okay.
Yes.
So when was this again? Do you remember roughly?
It's like only a few weeks after.
April.
Yeah. It didn't take lots of time actually for all of this to happen. Like a few weeks. We went back to our apartment, which is like 15 minutes a drive from the old city, and then my family were a bit concerned. We have this military bases in front of our apartment. It's not safe. The army is around. The American army is around, and maybe we should still go somewhere else.
Okay.
So we left to somewhere else, a neighborhood across the road, a bit safer. We rented a house with our neighbor, so I had time to play with other children, and then just hearing the helicopters all the time. Every day in the morning, they wake you up, these helicopters, all the time. And then when we returned to our apartment, that's when was the first and only time I saw an explosion in reality. Not if I'm in Baghdad, I would have seen lots of these, but in Najaf. So this military bases, as it happened after the Kuwait War, when people started robbing neighbors, again, many people just went to rob public government departments and anything that is owned by the previous government.
Actually not a fun fact, incredibly depressing fact. The only ministry that the US deployed soldiers to guard, I believe, was the Ministry of Oil.
Yeah.
Okay, which is where we saw looting and the Culture Ministry, the Rock Museum, just widespread chaos.
Yeah. It's like I only witnessed one of these. It's just this military base in front of us. And it's like everyone in my neighbor was just going out with a phone or a chair and people fighting or a lamb. And my father was like, this is crazy. And then we heard that we should be taking care of it because the military is going to come and demolish all of the mines. So there probably were mines.
Okay.
And then I was like, okay, so we stood in the balcony to watch as children. And then I remember that. I remember seeing huge white, like a nuclear bomb. Like you see this white smoke first.
Right.
And then being shaken, the whole building being shaken. Then seeing the fire.
Yeah.
And then hearing the sound, the blast. Yeah. And then hiding. And I still remember that moment as one of the most thrilling moments in my life. It's like, what is this? Humans do that? Like you create that? That was intense. That was one of the bombs that they had exploded. And that actually caused some people to die in the compound. It's like the blast and then the shake caused some apartments to have their glasses, their whole windows falling, some people to be concerned, like scared by the noise, and then it was very intense. But that's very small part of this 2003 experience that people in Baghdad and Basra and other parts seen completely differently, and the everyday explosions and then the interaction between Iraqi rebels and the American military. We didn't have that at that point yet in Najaf. But in other parts of the country, it's still going.
Okay, two things. You reminded me to just make the point, we haven't spoken about how many people died in this invasion, this war yet. It's actually very hard to get accurate figures. Between 2 to 3 million Iraqis died, right, under the Bush administration into the Obama administration from 2003. That's the best estimate I can find. That's just unfathomable in scale.
Yeah.
2, Saddam Hussein was still alive at this time. Maybe for listeners who are curious about what happened, you could just give a very brief summary.
I think that's where people were a bit concerned because, yes, Bush has announced the war has been a success. But where is Saddam Hussein? Like, this man is strong. He has all these great connections, and this Iraqi army is one of the strongest armies at that time. Like, no, we're not sure things are the way the Americans think. Where is Saddam Hussein? This was the question for months. It's like, we are not really feeling comfortable with the situation unless we answer that question, that big question.
What was the dynamic like? Because, Saddam, from everything I know, was a very brutal dictator, and anyone who would come out publicly in line with the US, or, I know the US was sort of working quite closely with politicians in exile and bringing people in, and that comes a bit later, but did it feel like a delicate balancing act? Were people nervous or wary of welcoming, if that's the right word, the US forces because they feared Saddam, backlash?
Many people were, and I would say it was a process of understanding what is happening, a confusion process. Where it started with,
I bet
is it happening?
The most confusing series of events ever, particularly for a child. My God, I can't even begin to imagine.
But this is, I would assume that was the realization process. People were like, is this really happening? And then I was like, oh, it did happen. Let's go to the street, destroy everything that has Saddam Hussein footages. So we always had these small structures with his paintings, his pictures everywhere. These were destroyed immediately. People were attacking them. His big statue in Baghdad, he has statues everywhere. People went and robbing the buildings, the government buildings. That was like, okay, things have happened. Then that's the moment after this was, I would say, the big question is like, so what next? And the what next stage is when people started to realize, oh, maybe that wasn't a move that is in the best interest of Iraqis.
I bet.
Yeah. And it's like, it was confusing, and then there was this trying to bring people who lobbied for the war, Iraqis who lobbied for the war from the state and the UK, who were coming and trying to form a government, and people were confused about what is happening. Having a very strong... So this is what happened to Iraqis. We had a very strong government that had access to everything, to information, to every household, very strong military, to not really knowing what is our country's situation now. I would say that must have been very disturbing to adults. As a child, I didn't realize that now, but just thinking...
We mentioned this earlier, but the entire unravelling of the state apparatus was, I don't know, I don't want to put words in people's mouths, but I feel like that was possibly one of the very worst decisions that was made. In terms of, if you look back on what happened in retrospect, Iraq now, many people argue is, well, not an entirely failed state, but its government, I don't know exactly.
It's very fragile country, yeah. Then this is one thing that I would say that's one of the motives to making this podcast is when I travel, especially to Arab countries, and people was like, why did you do this to Saddam Hussein? Saddam Hussein was good. So, for example, Jordan, Palestine, Egypt. These countries Saddam Hussein was very close to and he was supportive of. And so when I meet Palestinians, Jordanians, Egyptians, they always like, why did you do this to Saddam Hussein? And I understand where that come from. But I'm also thinking is like, we never had a choice as Iraqis.
No.
We weren't like giving the options like, do you want to do this or not? And then we're like, we'll do it. It just, everything was imposed on us. Saddam Hussein imposed wars and specific challenges. The economic sanction was imposed on us. And then 2003, everything after. So Iraqis, this is the point. This is, I would say, the main point here. Iraqis didn't have any hand in what happened in 2003. They were just observers of a country, their country being played with by unknown forces, which is very challenging, I would say, to accept and to even understand.
I bet. Yeah, maybe we can look at this in another episode. But the idea that these men, Paul Bremer, who would come in, Colin Powell in the US, Dick Cheney, George Bush, Tony Blair, had such an influence and an impact. I mean, it must be incredibly upsetting, frustrating, enraging, unjust.
I also remember that Bremer, who was sent to form the
CPA.
Yes, I remember him being the biggest name after Saddam Hussein in the country. Everybody was like, this person is here to do this, to delegate, help organize.
To install democracy.
Yeah, help organize that. And then the first thing he does is that demolish the Iraqi army. My father was in the Iraqi army. Many Iraqi men were in the army, and everybody recognized that this was not the smartest decision, because many of these people had loyalty to the country, not to the Saddam Hussein, and these are trained men.
Yeah.
These men have went through different wars. They're experienced.
They have weapons.
Now, exactly. Now you are making them enemies of the state. And that was it, the thing that I always hear my father complaining about is like, that decision wasn't well calculated. That what shows the weakness of that person who wanted to impose democracy. I would say impose democracy. We weren't even giving a choice to if we wanted. I know that when the constitution was developed and Iraqis were like a referendum happened on that. I know that Iraqis voted for it, but they didn't have alternatives, so they could pick and choose. It was like rush process just to install stability. So again, that also wasn't Iraqis' choice, I would say. I wouldn't say that there was other choices and things they had in mind, but again, everything, even now, still imposed on Iraqis. But yeah, it's like this decision on the Iraqi military was also one disappointment. Like, my father is a good man. Many Iraqi soldiers were good men who cared about their country. Saddam Hussein was a dictator who took them into war. It wasn't fair to them. Okay, I'll tell one very sad story. Very sad story. Okay, I might cry telling that. So my father, when he was in the military, he had this pilot, a friend, Sergeant Hila, and he was giving like a medal from Saddam Hussein for dropping one of the American helicopters during I would say after the Kuwait War. He was a very, very proud, very nice person, and he helped my father when we moved from Baghdad to Najaf. He showed us where, he helped my father find a place. He spent lots of time with my brothers and sisters, my family, with his children, and we liked that person. I still remember him as a person who told my father, I still remember I told him, he's like, this daughter of yours has a talent, keep an eye on her. And I was like, yeah, somebody recognized me.
What a lovely thing to
And I like that person. So what happened to that person? He was in the military. He was like one of the most senior, noble military guys. And this decision affected him, and like have lost his job, have lost everything that he done during his life, like being trained and defending his country, and being told to go out and figure it out. So eventually, the only thing he was able to do is to sell chicken in the market. And his son got sick. His son was around my age, but at that time, like few years after the war that happened, his son got sick, and he couldn't afford treating his son. So he lost his son. And a few months after, he died too. For me, that's a sad story, because this is a national loss. This person really, genuinely was a nice person. He cared about his country, he had a nice family, and when he wasn't giving solutions, alternatives, he tried to figure it out, just as a normal person, just go to the market, figure out life. But to be deprived of your rights, someone who served the country couldn't afford to treat your only son and lose him. It's just very sad for me. And this is one story. Many other men who also defended this country spent time training, and this was their life. One Stephen also had very challenging time because of that decision. I know the political
background to making such decision, but then I'm also aware of the human side of it. And that one story is just very, very close to me because he was genuinely a nice person, and that he didn't deserve what happened to him.
Thank you for sharing that
Yeah.
story. It's really important. It's
Yeah.
so important. And it makes me feel so ashamed because we don't know these stories. And actually something that really struck me earlier in this conversation, I wanted to mention at the end, is how limited the understanding is. I can't speak for the US. I can't really even speak for any other country other than the UK where I grew up. Germany, because they didn't support the coalition, they kind of were neutral in the face of the US invasion. I think they have a bit more of a critical view of the war, but again, German politics aside, they were quite a weak country in 2003. Anyway, something that really hits me quite hard is how, and I'm a little bit ashamed to admit this, and I didn't think I would say it on the podcast, but I'm going to say it. You were so brave and open just then. If I hadn't moved here, if I hadn't had left university and fallen into a job that was vaguely Middle East focused and had to learn a lot very quickly about Iraq, if I hadn't become so personally invested in this country, I really wouldn't know. I would not understand the impact of this war on Iraq. There's no way I would have. We don't talk about it in the UK. We don't. It's not. It's really. I'm trying to think of the right word. There's no accountability, really. I mean, there was a report in 2016 called the Chilcot Report, and it was basically, it was an incredibly long inquiry. It was a decade long, looking into whether the grounds for the Iraq invasion were justified, speaking to lots of British civil servants, whatever. And it found that, I don't know whether this is interesting, but maybe it is for particularly Iraqis listening to this podcast, it took 7 years for this report to be published, said John Chilcot. It's published 2016. Found that Saddam Hussein posed no urgent threat to British interests. The intelligence regarding weapons of mass destruction was presented with unwarranted certainty, basically was inaccurate. Peaceful alternatives to war had not been exhausted. And that the UK and the US had undermined the authority of the United Nations Security Council, basically found that the war was unnecessary. Okay, so this came, what was it, 2016, 13 years after the war. This is probably one of the only pieces of sort of the British narrative around the war that I can think of that said, guys, hello, like this wasn't right. And for me, that is just incredibly shocking when I hear stories of what happened in this country. I don't know if this is even relevant, but it just makes me really ashamed. And I also wanted to mention that there was a big protest the month before the invasion, February 15th of February. It was the anti-war march. I think there were lots around the world. I know in London there was about 200,000 people who marched. There was opposition among, lots of people, but it didn't make a difference. I remember this. I was 9 at the time. I remember this march. I remember because I knew a few people from our village who went, and I think I remember still the conversations people were having about, well, is it justified? Should they go? But no one was talking about the human impact. I don't think people talk about the human impact enough. Someone messaged me after I shared the last podcast, and it's someone I really admire and respect. He's a friend from Mosul. He said 2003 marked the end of Iraq as a nation.
Yeah.
Maybe that's something we can talk about.
If we would talk about this in a later episode. But 2019, when many young Iraqis, I went also out to the street, took it to the street, demanding what? A nation. We wanted a nation because we felt like all this time we didn't feel it. Anyways, but yeah, exactly. Evidence very weak. Iraqis think that again this Saddam Hussein approach to trying to liberate Palestine, but then also at the same time, Iraq is a resourceful country. So we do think about
We've
the
got all this
resources.
far without talking about oil. My goodness.
It's like oil. There was a whole government falling. There's so much money, so much gold that you could put your hands on.
Another, it's not conspiracy, but it's an argument that I've had put to me. In 2002, Iraq became the first country to market its oil in euros rather than US dollars, right? This is probably another thing going on in back of people's minds.
So, there's always an economic side to war. Probably there was also this also carries a big influence on why this whole thing has happened. But just returning to Iraqi side of the whole situation, I would say one of the moments that Iraqi started to realize, no, this is actually happening, is when the two sons of Saddam Hussein, and I think one of his grandchildren, were hiding in a house in Baghdad, and it was discovered. And the Americans just completely wrapped the house with bullets, and his two sons were killed, and the godson, I'm not sure. But the footages of his sons, like, completely, like, filled with bullets, people were a bit shocked, and it's like, this actually did happen. These are the children of this Saddam Hussein. Have already been killed in this way. It did happen. This is concerning, and many of Saddam Hussein close team members weren't found. And so I don't know if you remember, but I remember at that time the Americans, they had these card games with the pictures of like these 51 or what, I don't know what wanted.
Gosh, yeah.
And then they kept looking for them, and with many of these people, yeah, exactly, very high level government people are not found. So it's still a concern that poses a threat to Iraqis who feel like his sons are killed now. He might do something. I remember it because there's one other thing. People knew that Saddam Hussein's children, especially his oldest, wasn't the nicest person.
No.
He has some terrible, disturbing
This is
stories. Yeah, or they. So people seeing him in this situation, even though that they know how terrible he is, they were like, this is a bit violating for a human. So many Iraqis are Muslims, and in Islam, in true Islam, and I think generally people believe you shouldn't kill a human in this way.
Yeah,
it's like still human. They could have handled it some different way. So that was a bit for them. It's like dehumanifying.
Do you remember when that was, roughly?
I would say a few months after the war.
So,
this is the interesting bit. It's like Saddam Hussein family probably were also a bit surprised about the war. It just happened over a sudden. They didn't plan their escape, or they were sure that they would be able to defend the country, but people didn't really want them.
So December 13th, 2001, Saddam Hussein is captured by US forces. Kind of wraps up the year, this horrific year, marking the next stage of Iraq.
There are some theories here. Iraqis always believe that there are multiple Saddam Husseins. So many people believe that there's no way this is him. And then they started comparing the pictures. But when the trial happened, people were sure that this is Saddam Hussein. Interestingly, as I told you, as a child, I was somehow forced, and many children's, to change the way we viewed that person. From someone we had these pictures and saying everywhere in our textbooks,
it's another point of massive
to someone, to someone who's like war criminal. And then, so for me, I wasn't willing to watch the trials. I knew my father, like every time there was a trial on TV, he watched it, puts time into it. Iraqi men, they gather and they watch it. They want to hear the stories. They want to see the case unfold. But as a child, I was like, I don't know. I was like, well, I don't know. I don't want to be related to it. I don't want to be anywhere close to what is happening. So, but going up, seeing footages from the trial. I still haven't watched the whole thing. I plan one day to watch the whole thing. Because people are divided when it comes to the trial. Saddam Hussein, many people say he maintained his personalities, like being confident, honest,
Do you remember
confirming
Yeah.
he was confirming his decisions. He was still believing in everything he's done. I was like, I've done it for the best interest of the country and for Arabs. He was looking confident, strong, a bit skinny, but that's when people like, this is Saddam Hussein, because they were shocked, like, Saddam Hussein, this hero who had a palace everywhere in the country, was in a hole under the ground, in this very
it's quite a shift in
it's like we didn't believe that. It was like the Americans just trying to confirm that they won the war. But then the trial was a very interesting time also for Iraqis. Probably it's worth looking into it and discuss it a bit more, because it's still like there are still many people in Iraq who think that Saddam Hussein time was a good time, and that they still like him as a person.
Well, especially now, and this is something I feel we should wrap this episode up, but at a later stage, I would be really curious to talk to you about the people now who look back on Saddam's period, much like they look back on the Iraqi kind of the monarchy period, with not particularly rose-tinted glasses, but comparing it to what's happening today.
Yeah.
I think that's a really curious thing to look at. But I'd really like to end, if we can, just letting you speak again about your personal experience of this 1 year, 2003.
One last thing I want to add about Saddam Hussein and this court case, it somehow was good for Saddam Hussein's image, the trial and the way his life was ended. People were sympathizing.
Yeah.
And that wasn't very good for the general situation. People wanted to move out of this, but then to seeing this person still confirming his decisions, and then being...
This was a few years later, right?
Yeah.
He was executed in 2006.
Yeah.
So,
and on the first day of Eid. Again, for Muslims, that's like a no.
Yeah.
Anyways, so this is actually a very interesting thing to look into. But for me personally, I would just end it with one story, actually. A few months after the war, we took a break from school, and then that's when I said I like the Iraqi mothers, because then we were encouraged to go back to school. Our teachers wanted to go back, even though there is no government, no system. Let's just go back with the same textbooks, just remove Saddam Hussein pictures, scrub his sayings, and just go back to school. So we went back to school, and I go back to school, and there is a huge, massive hole in the wall caused by a tank, probably American tank, and the tank was in the middle of the playground where we had a basketball yard. And I was like, I don't feel safe in my school anymore. Anybody can come in, and camels were coming in and out. And then bullet holes all around. And so we were seated in our classroom. This is a very funny situation. It's great, actually, end for this episode. 11-year-old girls sitting in our classroom, same situation. Americans, we were told Americans are in the school. That was my first interaction with Americans.
No way.
American military army group is in the school. They are just going around. And then we had this 2 young Americans. I now see them, and I was like, very silly guys. Very young, dressed in their uniform.
How young do you think they were?
I was like early 20s.
Oh my God.
They came to the classroom. They saw Saddam Hussein picture framed on the wall above the whiteboard. It was a green board. Anyway, they flipped it, and they were like, no, not anymore. And they were cheering, and we were like, yeah.
How you were all 11, 12 years old?
Yeah.
Absolutely nothing to do with the regime.
I was like, we didn't understand. And then they came, and they was like, what do you need? And our teacher, she was like hiding her face and laughing and smiling. I was like, we need a new desk and stuff.
We need a whole new school. Thanks very much. Yeah.
And then they're a much senior. You can tell a much senior soldier came into the room, and he just stood in front of these 2 guys, saying, he said in a very Iraqi phrase, shakumaku, which is what's up? And we were smiling. I was like, alhamdulillah. And that's the funny bit. It's like all of us, this young girl, we were laughing when he said shakumaku. But there was a bit older student still remember her. She was sitting in the back, and she had her hands under her jaws, and she was like, Alhamdulillah. And in a way, it's like, no, not Alhamdulillah, Rahmat Allah, which is under God's mercy. And she said it in a way, I was like, I don't like you. And I remember us turning at her. Probably some of us thought that's rude, but some of us were like, maybe you're right.
Yeah.
It's like we're under God's mercy. What is happening to our school? And I have to say, at that time, schools were very organized systems for Iraqi students. Like, we had to dress certain way, act certain way, stand and talk certain way. So for us, that was chaos happening in a school. And yeah, that's the moment I realized maybe what happened could have different layers into it.